So it's actually kind of funny because Batsy left out a little part of the story. So how I met her was there was this woman that was trying to bully her on a Facebook forum, and it was ridiculous. She just kept insulting Batsy, and Batsy just kept, quoting statistics to her. And it got to the point where I was just kind of in this group watching because I was interested in the Middle East. I always have been. So I see this woman that's trying to clearly bully Batsy, and she had a bunch of her little minions, and they were all posting. There's probably about 20 or 30 of them. And I didn't really think that was very fair. So all I did was I just posted, why don't you guys just maybe stick to the facts instead of the personal attacks? And so then they started attacking me, which I thought was kind of funny. So that person, by the way, I don't know how many of you guys are familiar with Greta Berlin. So, yeah. Yeah. Same here. There's probably a few of us in here, yeah. I don't know how much of an honor that is anymore. I think it's, yeah, exactly. So anyways, that's kind of how I started getting a little more involved in the advocacy end of it. Really how everything kind of started for me was in the early 90s, my dad was involved in Native rights in Canada. So, Indigenous rights for Indigenous Canadians. So kind of the way it transitioned for me was I was at a place called the University of Alberta, and I was walking to class one day, and I played football. And so I was walking to class, and on my way back from class, I wanted to go to my locker room. And now the way that the University of Alberta's athletic wing is built, it's like a big donut. It's called the Van Vliet Center. And everything's in a big circle. So I came in through the regular doors that I come in for, and I see this wall. And it's between me and where I want to go. And I was walking with a little Jewish friend of mine. At the time, I didn't even realize that she was Jewish. I'd known her for probably 4 or 5 years. These kinds of things you don't even really talk about in Canada because it's not, who cares what religion you are, right? Well, for some of us, who cares? So I go to walk to this wall, and I'm like, hey, what's this? It's in my way. And there's these kids, and they're sitting at a table, and they're handing out pamphlets. So I pick a pamphlet up, and it's talking about Israel apartheid. So I look at it, and I was like, so what's the deal here? And they said, well, we want you to understand how the Palestinians feel, so we put this wall up, so now you have to go all the way around to get to your locker, even though your locker's only 20 feet that way. That's what they said to me. So I kind of looked at her, and I was like, yeah, I don't like that. I think I'm just going to go to my locker. And she's like, no. And I was like, what do you mean no? Like, I pay tuition, and I'm on the football team, which means I'm better than you. So she didn't like that. So it was really funny because the girl I was with, she starts pulling me away, and she's like, don't worry, don't fight with them. It's not worth it because they're just going to get worse, right? I didn't realize at the time what she had meant. I kind of thought she was being a wuss. So I finally told the girl, I'm like, okay, well, we can do this one of two ways. You can move the wall, or I can move the wall. And if I move it, I can't guarantee it'll be in the same shape that it was when I moved it. So she's like, she brought these 2 Arab dudes who, I don't know, maybe they had Chihuahua syndrome because they were about this big. And they come walking up to me, and they're like, you have to go around. And sorry about the language here, but I was like, yeah, I don't think that's going to happen. And they got really upset at me, and I was like, okay, like I said, move the fucking wall or I'll move it. So then the one guy kind of stepped in front of me, so I just kind of did this, and maybe with a little more alacrity. And so he sat down, kind of. And so then I just walked over to the wall, and I can still remember it because it's really funny that I remember this. The things you do remember exactly, like it's crystal clear in my head. I reached up, and I just literally went like this. And then I looked at them just to make sure that they knew, and then I did this while I was looking at them, and then I walked through. My friend didn't want to walk through, and I'll get back to that in a minute. So long story short, well, not really so short, but they got really upset, and they started yelling names at me, and I thought it was pretty funny because they were very small, so I started yelling back. But then some of my teammates came, and they didn't like the fact that these guys were even in our, it's the athletic area, and we don't like the nerds. So they came over, and they started yelling at the guys, and they're like, get out of here, beat it. We don't want your political bullshit here. We're here to play football. My friend still wouldn't walk through. She still walked all the way around. So I talked to her about it after because I was actually really upset with her. I said, listen, what were you doing? I moved the wall. You didn't have to walk all the way around. That took you half an hour. And she said something that stuck with me for a long time. She said, if I would have walked with you guys aren't with me all the time. And what'll end up happening is the next time they see me, they'll harass me even more. Now, at the time, had no idea what she was talking about. I was like, what are you talking about? We're at the U of A. Now, as a Native person, I deal with racism quite regularly. It's something that to me, it's almost like water off a duck's back, a really large duck. But it doesn't bother me anymore. I just ignore it. But what I didn't realize is that sometimes there's some forms of racism that I didn't see because I was so inured to it. I didn't realize that it's actually pretty much accepted to be anti-Semitic in Canada. It's not looked at the same way as racism of other types, even racism against Native people. Like, those are kind of the two really, I hesitate to say accepted, but I'll say more accepted versions of it. Especially in Western Canada, it's getting to the point now where sometimes it's actually difficult to be a Native person. So one way that I illustrate it is I usually show people my Native ID card, but unfortunately I actually petitioned the government to get an ID card like every other white Canadian. The government actually fought me a little bit on it, but I now have an ID card that no longer has my blood quantum, and it doesn't have my Indian number. Now, something that most of you probably have no idea about is that in Canada, there's two sets of laws. Now, this is going to sort of segue into why I'm so pro-Israel, because when I hear somebody say that Israel is an apartheid state, I get really pissed off, because I actually come from one. And it's not really well known, because most people that are Canadian, especially white Canadians, they have no idea, because they will literally go their entire lives and not know anything about Native people in Canada. And I see it constantly. So basically, this is how it starts. There's a thing called the Indian Act. Now, the Indian Act in Canada is a separate set of laws. That separate set of laws basically tells you all that I'm a ward of this state. So I don't know about you guys, but do I look like a child? A pretty big child, But if I go to court, I can't represent myself. Any other Canadian citizen can represent themselves. A Native Canadian is not allowed to represent themselves in court because we're a ward of the state. So we have to have someone advocate for us. So that's kind of where I came from with, why I advocate and why I stand up, because sometimes stuff pisses me off and then I got to say something because I can't just be quiet. Now, this goes back to my friend with the anti-Semitism, because this kind of stuff really bothers me. Like seeing somebody bullying, like it affects me. And I wrote an article a long time ago about it because when I was little, I was really little. I know it's hard to believe and nobody ever believes me until they look on my Facebook and see the pictures of me. But yeah, for real. So I grew up and I kind of understood instinctively that sometimes, you're going to get bullied. It's just the way life goes, right? But that doesn't mean I have to like it. So this is kind of one of those ways this manifests, is I don't like to see other people getting bullied. It kind of irks me. So I started standing up. Now, the thing is with Botsy, like I said, with the Greta Berlin crap, that kind of got me a little more motivated. I was still doing Native rights advocacy in Canada. I was still involved with trying to remove corrupt chiefs. That's kind of how everyone knows me in Canada. Because I would give them advice if they had a chief that was stealing money. I would explain to them, the rules of evidence and stuff like that. There was a little group of us, and that's kind of what we did, right? So that's how I was kind of still involved in the Native rights. Then all of a sudden, I saw this stuff happen with Botsy, and then a bunch more stuff happened where basically, after I stuck up for Botsy, people were sending me messages that were pretty ridiculous. And I think they thought that if they threatened me, that I would stop. They clearly didn't know me very well, but that's literally what I think they thought, because it got to the point where, I was getting 13, 14, 15 private messages a day. And stuff about, you don't know anything about Israel, you should shut up. Now, I should say, I'm a history nerd. So I read a lot of books about history. And in university and in high school, and even before that when I was just a rugrat, I used to read a lot of stuff about the Middle East, just because it always interested me, the whole region. So I actually know a little bit about what I'm talking about. I'm not just talking out of my ass. Like some people will say, I know about Sykes-Picot, and then you ask them, so what is Sykes-Picot? I don't know, it's a piece of paper. But I actually have enough grounding in the subject that once I started reading a little bit deeper, I could actually bring those things up in arguments, which is really humorous when you're discussing the rights of the Israeli people on their own land, when the other person has absolutely no idea what you're talking about, because they look a little bit foolish, right? But then one day I was actually talking to Botsy. It's funny because Botsy and another person named Philippe Asseline are really the two people that kind of solidified the argument that I use. Because one day I was talking to Botsy and she said, this is where my people are from. Like this is our land. And like, you know it on an instinctive level. And I mean, even it seems like common sense to all of you. I'm sure everybody in here knows Israel is Jewish land. I mean, it's where you're from, right? So nobody ever thinks to say, maybe I should have a solid argument that everything's backed up by facts and by anthropology and science. We just think of it as it's common sense. So, you know, like, what kind of moron thinks we're not, right? It's like saying Indians aren't really from Canada, but you'd be surprised. People actually tell me I'm from Russia. So, but at the end of the day, that really solidified it. I started talking to Philippe a little bit more about it. I said, you know, like, I said, maybe somebody should come up with like a solid argument, an argument that's just airtight when we're talking about Jewish rights in Israel. Like, we shouldn't have anything to do with religion because, no offense, 9 times out of 10, when you bring up religion, you're going to offend at least 50% of the people. And the thing is, when you bring up a religious argument, I'm not saying that's not valid. It's always good to have that as an extra argument. But when that's your primary argument, especially in the modern day, it tends to fall flat on deaf ears. So what I did was I actually went through and I did a lot of research. Like I said, I'm a nerd. I like to read. So I found a book that was by this anthropologist. And the funny part about this story now is that he's anti-Israel. He's from Venezuela. And he's an anthropologist who studies the rights of indigenous people. He came up with a checklist. Now, I was reading his stuff, and I was kind of, I'm not going to lie, at first I almost put the book down, because it was funny. He kept talking about colonizing and colonialists, and then he started talking about Israel, and like he brought up modern-day colonial states, and he named Israel, but oddly enough, he also named Pakistan, which they almost never do. So, you know, I was reading this, and I almost put it down, but then he said something that resonated with me, and I'm really glad that it did, because then I dug a little bit deeper. He said that indigenous status cannot be taken through conquering an indigenous people. Now, that's something that is really important, and I'll explain why in a second, but whenever we're making our arguments about Israeli rights to the Holy Land, that's an integral part of it, because you do not lose your indigenous status through being conquered, ever. It's not something that can happen. So I started digging a little bit more. And then it turns out that in 1971, he actually wrote a checklist. And the funny part was, he was trying to twist the checklist so it would fit the Palestinians. But it actually had the exact opposite effect. Every single thing that he added, it compounded the fact that, in fact, the Palestinians are not an indigenous people. And that was the funny part. Because he was trying so hard to turn the facts to his narrative, it actually, it must have clicked with him, because I've spoken to his son by email. And in the end, near the last couple of years, he's actually kind of shifted, and he's not pro-Israel, but he's not anti-Israel anymore. Because now he understands that the Jewish people are an indigenous people. How he came to the conclusion was he built this checklist, and the checklist is really simple. It's about the genesis of culture, language, traditions, all on an ancestral land. So some people always ask you, like, you know, when you talk about indigenous stuff, they're going to say, well, you weren't here first. Well, what's that? Yeah, that's part of the culture. Believe me, I know. I love it here. So, good food. But, yeah. Anyways, now look what you did. Now I lost my track of thought because I'm thinking about hummus. So, okay, so basically, it's important to understand, though, that it's about the genesis of these things. It's not about being there first, all right? And the reason that that's actually important for my people in particular is because we're Métis. Now, some of you don't really know what that means. What it means is that there's a people in Canada that are considered to be an indigenous people by every major anthropologist. So it's important you understand that. It's not one or two, you know, liberal guys or righty guys. It's every single major anthropologist agrees that the Métis are an indigenous people. There's never an argument anymore. They tried arguing it for 20 years with the Canadian government because the Canadian government was pissed off. They lost. We won. We're indigenous. Too bad for them. What it means is we're a combination people, literally. So we're a combination of Europeans who came here, or came to Canada. Sorry, I'm used to being in Canada. Who came to Canada in the 1700s, and they intermarried with native people. But there was a genesis of language, tradition, culture on an ancestral land. Now, there's one other thing that I neglected to bring up, but it's actually integral to how I approach this and how I'm going to get my people to start being a little bit more pro-Israel and kind of get rid of the asshats. It's really simple. Sacred sites. Sacred sites are integral, and they're super important to us. And since traveling here, yeah, that's the thing, right? It's, since traveling here, I realized how important they are to you. Okay. So the Métis come from a place called the Red River. It's in Manitoba. It's a very, very small area geographically. What happened was the government came and they realized, well, that's really good farmland. Our people were like, the easiest way to explain it is we had actually started building towns, right? And so we built towns, but we would still go on the buffalo hunt like the other natives in the area. So we would go on the buffalo hunt, but then we would bring everything back to the towns. And we actually did some limited farming. So we were starting to develop more into almost being like what you guys would call civilized, I guess, right? So we're not civilized, by the way. We're pretty savage. So
How many are you?
right now, okay, so the settlement that I'm from, Paddle Prairie, I believe the population is about 1,500. Now in Alberta altogether, probably about 10,000 of us. And then if you take all of Canada, it's a huge argument because according to the government of Canada, there's almost 1 million of us. But the government of Canada has actually tried to tell everybody that anybody with any blood quantum at all, so anybody that even has like a drop of native blood is Métis. So we've actually been fighting them in the courts because it's our right to self-identify. And what they're doing is they're trying to delegitimize our Indigenous rights by attacking us with blood quantum, which is a colonial invention. So what they want is they want us to say, okay, well, anybody that's part Indian is Métis, so now we're not special, we're not from a specific area, they don't have to deal with the land claims anymore because they can say, well, anybody that's part Native is Métis. So we've actually been fighting that fight in the courts. But, so, yeah, like I was saying about sacred sites, so I saw how important they are to your people, right? And it, like I really saw it. And I, yeah. Well, it's important, right? So, man, I hate this. You guys, it's crazy. I've cried more since I've been here than I have in 10 years. But, yeah, so it's important, though, because we're trying to do that where I'm from. So, like, Diane knows about this. I've talked to her about it. They're actually, and it's funny, because whenever I tell Jewish people this, they lose their minds. They're bulldozing a graveyard in Edmonton. And that graveyard is thousands of years old. I have relatives buried there. They're bulldozing it to build a power plant. And they know the graveyard's there. They've found graves. They've found artifacts. Still going to bulldoze it. Their excuse is that because it was turned into a graveyard probably 500 or 600 years ago by white people, so some white people settled at Fort Edmonton, and they buried a few people there. Oh, thank you. Thanks. So they